this space. The varied perspectives. These are the journalisms by way of analytic aggregation, illuminated from the critical research and history.
Engage impulse engines. Engage.
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 Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
China and Russia signed 14 agreements. Watch this space. In Moscow, Xi and Putin bury Pax Americana. This from the Cradle. In Moscow this week, the Chinese and Russian leaders revealed their joint commitment to redesign the global order and undertake that which has not been seen in 100 years. What has just taken place in Moscow is nothing less than a new Yalta, which incidentally is in Crimea. But unlike the momentous meeting of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in USSR run Crimea in 1945, this is the first time in arguably 5 centuries that no political leader from the West is setting the global agenda. It's Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin that are now running the multilateral, multipolar show. Western exceptionalists may deploy their crybaby routines as much as they want. Nothing will change the spectacular optics and the underlying substance of this developing world order, especially for the global south. What Xi and Putin are setting out to do was explained in detail before their summit in 2 op-eds pinned by the presidents themselves. Like a highly synchronized Russian ballet, Putin's visit was laid out in the People's Daily in China, focusing on a future-bound partnership, while Xi's was published in the Russian Gazette and the RIA Novosti website, focusing on a new chapter in cooperation and common development. Right from the start of the summit, the speeches by both Xi and Putin drove the NATO crowd into a hysterical frenzy of anger and envy. Russian Foreign Minister spokeswoman Maria Zakharova perfectly captured the mood when she remarked that the West was foaming at the mouth. The front page of the Russian Gazette on Monday was iconic. Putin touring Nazi-free Mariupol, chatting with residents side by side with Xi's op-ed. That was in a nutshell Moscow's terse response to Washington's MQ-9 Reaper stunt and the International Criminal Court kangaroo court shenanigans. Foam at the mouth as much as you like, NATO. You're in the process of being thoroughly humiliated in Ukraine. And during the first informal meeting, Xi and Putin talked for no less than 4.5 hours at the end. Putin personally escorted Z to his limo. This conversation was the real deal, mapping out the lineaments of multipolarity, which starts with the solution for Ukraine. Predictably, there were very few leaks from the Sherpas, but there was quite a significant one on their in-depth exchange on Ukraine. Putin politely stressed he respects China's position expressed in Beijing's 12-point conflict resolution plan, which was completely rejected by Washington, but the Russian position remains ironclad demilitarization, Ukrainian neutrality, and enshrining the new facts on the ground. In parallel, the Foreign Ministry completely ruled out a role for the US, UK, France, and Germany in future Ukraine negotiations. They're not considered neutral mediators. A multipolar patchwork quilt. The next day was all about business, everything from energy and military technical cooperation to improving the efficacy of trade and economic corridors running through Eurasia. Russia already ranks first as natural gas supplier to China, surpassing Turkmenistan and Qatar. Most of it via the 3,000-kilometer Power of Siberia pipeline that runs from Siberia to China's northeastern Heilongjiang province, launched in December 2019. Negotiations on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline via Mongolia are advancing fast. Sino-Russian cooperation in high-tech will go through the roof. 79 projects over $165 billion. Everything from liquefied natural gas to aircraft construction, machine tool construction, space research, agro-industry, upgraded economic corridors. The Chinese president explicitly said he wants to link the new Silk Road projects to the Eurasia Economic Union. This BRIEAEU interpolation is a natural evolution. China's already signed an economic cooperation deal with EAEU. Russian macroeconomic Uber strategist Sergei Glazyev's ideas are finally bearing fruit. And last but not least, there will be a new drive towards mutual settlements in national currencies and between Asia and Africa for Latin America. For all practical purposes, Putin endorsed the role of the Chinese yuan as the new trade currency of choice, while the complex discussions on a new reserve currency backed by gold and/or commodities proceed. This joint economic business offensive ties in with the concerted Russia-China diplomatic offensive to remake vast swaths of West Asia and Africa. Chinese diplomacy works like the matryoshka, Russian stacking dolls, in terms of delivering subtle messages. It's far from coincidental that Xi's trip to Moscow exactly coincides with the 20th anniversary of American shock and awe and the illegal invasion, occupation, and destruction of Iraq. Yeah, I'm of the mind that we should start calling that Multipolar Day, Multipolar World Day, maybe on the day of the Iraqi invasion, so-called anniversary. We should rename it Multipolar World Day, because that's where it began. And well, either that or we could call the day that Mossadegh was couped in 1953, Multipolar World Day. In parallel, over 40 delegations from Africa arrived in Moscow a day before Z to take part in a Russia-Africa in the Multipolar World Parliamentary Conference, a run-up to the second Russia-Africa Summit next July. The area surrounding the Duma looked just like the old non-aligned movement days when most of Africa kept very close anti-imperialist relations with the USSR. Putin chose this exact moment to write off more than $20 billion in African debt. In West Asia, Russia and China are acting totally in sync. West Asia, the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, was actually jump-started by Russia in Baghdad and Oman. It was these negotiations that led to the signing of a deal in Beijing. Moscow is also coordinating the Syria-Turkey rapprochement discussions. Russian diplomacy with Iran, now under strategic partnership status, is kept on a separate track. Diplomatic sources confirm that Chinese intelligence, via its own investigations, is now fully assured of Putin's vast popularity across Russia, and even within the country's political elites, that means conspiracies of the regime change variety are out of the question. This was fundamental for Xi and the Zongnanhai's, China's central HQ for party and state officials, decision to bet on Putin as a trusted partner in the coming years, considering he may run and win the next presidential elections. China's always about continuity. So, the Xi-Putin summit definitively sealed China-Russia as a comprehensive strategic partner for the long haul, committed to developing serious geopolitical, geoeconomic competition with declining Western hegemons. This is the new world born in Moscow this week. Putin previously defined it as a new anti-colonial policy. It's now laid out as a multipolar patchwork quilt. There's no turning back on the demolition of the remnants of Pax Americana. Before European hegemony, the world system AD 1250 to 1350, Janet Abu Lughod built a carefully constructed narrative showing the prevailing multipolar order when the West lagged behind the Orient. Later, the West only pulled ahead because the Orient was temporarily in disarray. We may be witnessing a similarly historic shift in the making, trespassed by a revival of Confucianism, respect for authority, emphasis on social harmony, the equilibrium inherent to the thou, and the spiritual power of Eastern Orthodoxy. This is indeed a civilizational fight. Moscow finally welcoming the first sunny days of spring provided this week a larger-than-life illustration of weeks where decades happen compared to decades where nothing happens. The two presidents bid farewell in a poignant manner. Now, there are changes that haven't happened in 100 years. When we together, we drive these changes. Putin, I agree. Z, take care, dear friend. Putin, have a safe trip. Here's to a new day dawning from the lands of the rising sun to the Eurasian steppes. In Moscow, Z and Putin bury Pax Americana. In Moscow this week, Chinese and Russian leaders revealed their joint commitment to redesign the global order and undertake that which has not been seen in 100 years. And from CGTN, Russia and Chinese economies complement each other perfectly. Kirill Brybevs, the acting director of the Institute of China and Modern Asia at the Academy of Academic Studies, and a member of the Russian International Affairs. He's the writer of this article. On March 21, Russian President Vladimir Putin held talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. This meeting was anticipated to be of a protocol nature and be limited to typical statements on a comprehensive strategic partnership and everlasting friendship. However, the meeting proved to have been thoroughly prepared in terms of content. The leaders discussed many precise initiatives that are essential for Russia's economy. It was a genuinely constructive meeting. In February 2022, the leaders of Russia and China published a statement establishing the principles of interaction and presenting a common perspective on basic concepts of the world order. Nowadays, this foundation is guiding the bilateral partnership. It's raised very specific issues, projects, and industries in which Russia and China interact and plan to boost cooperation. It's now time to implement these intentions, but at least the fact that both presidents are committed to profound and concrete partnership is obvious to the world. The mutual statement covered the main spheres for further interaction. Energy cooperation will obviously expand. The leaders have discussed it many times, and the projects have already been launched. The power of Siberia and the new Soyuz Vostok gas pipeline will increase trade in gas, as well as agreements between Rosneft and CNPC, which will bolster oil supplies. However, it's noteworthy that the statement also indicated the main problem areas of bilateral relations, such as logistics, payments in national currencies, localization of production, and e-commerce. These are issues that require the serious participation of both governments, an impetus for business and enhanced regularity environment. The launch of these and their transformations into real projects will very quickly allow Russia and China to create a powerful infrastructure independent of external pressure, which will promote future trade and economic interaction in general. The Russian and Chinese economies complement each other well today. They're like two halves of a puzzle that fit together perfectly. Russia needs components and equipment, machine tools, and industrial goods to be independent of Western imports and fill the gaps that have opened up after the departure of Western companies. Because of this mutual necessity, China-Russia cooperation is mutually beneficial. However, it's important for Russia that Chinese corporations not only import goods, but also produce them in Russia. And this was emphasized in the joint statement. Today, not only are raw materials important to China, but also other Russian products. For example, agriculture was mentioned separately in the leader's statement. China is very interested in the products of the Russian agricultural industry. During the extended negotiations, a document was even signed on the creation of a separate directorate that will deal with soybeans. This is a giant market. It's very good that this was given extra momentum at the leaders' meeting. Secondly, the Chinese market's interested in Russia's chemical products, which are unstable if exported to the West. Therefore, Russia's interests with China also coincide here. The Chinese market's very important for Russian chemists. Finally, petroleum products and petrochemicals are equally important. It's important that the construction of plants to produce petroleum products takes place on Russia's territory in the Siberian and Far Eastern regions to meet the demands of the Chinese market, but at the same time providing tax revenues to the Russian budget. Today, leaders from China and Russia are looking at the medium-term perspective, and cooperation plans already cover the entire current decade. It's very important for China to look to the future with a sense of stability and confidence. Current relations between Russia and China give us all such an opportunity. From MENA FN, Russia-China's partnership in nuclear innovation, implications for global energy landscape. Russia and China have recently announced a partnership to deepen their cooperation in the development of fast neutron reactors for nuclear energy, with the aim of creating a comprehensive program that would shape the global nuclear energy sector for decades to come. This latest agreement was signed between Russia's state-run nuclear energy giant Rosatom and the China National Nuclear Cooperation, the CNNP, and covers key areas of cooperation such as the expansion of existing projects and the launch of new initiatives related to fast neutron reactors, uranium-plutonium fuel production, and spent nuclear fuel management. This announcement was made during a 3-day visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow, where he and Russian President Vladimir Putin discussed various avenues of collaboration between their countries. China currently operates 5 Russian nuclear reactors, with 4 more under construction, making Russia the largest nuclear supplier to China. This long-term nuclear deal between Russia and China is expected to have significant implications for the global nuclear energy sector as the two countries work to develop advanced technologies and expand their nuclear capabilities as part of this partnership. They'll draw up a roadmap for cooperation in the years to come, which could have a major impact on the future of nuclear energy worldwide. From Tasnim news agency, Russia, China to cooperate in developing fast neutron reactors in nuclear energy sector. Rosatom, Russia's state-run nuclear energy company, announced on Wednesday that Russia and China will collaborate in developing fast neutron reactors for the long term. Moscow and Beijing are deepening their partnership in nuclear energy and will draw up a roadmap for cooperation in developing so-called fast neutron reactors for decades to come. Rosatom announced on Wednesday. According to the company, the comprehensive program lays the ground not only for bilateral cooperation, but also will essentially influence the shape of the global nuclear energy sector, RT reported. The document signed between Rosatom and the China National Nuclear Corporation covers key areas and is focused on expanding current cooperation as well as launching new projects related to fast neutron reactors, the production of uranium-plutonium fuel, and the management of spent nuclear fuel. The announcement of a long-term nuclear deal came among a raft of agreements presented during a 3-day visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow. China already operates 5 Russian nuclear reactors and currently has 4 more under construction, which makes Russia the largest nuclear supplier to the country. Last year, Rosatom launched the construction of Zudabu 4 reactor and the Tianwan 8 reactor in the Jiangsu province in eastern China. The reactors will be powered by 3rd-generation pressurized water reactor technology supplied by Rosatom, with operations set to begin between 2026 and 2028, according to the agreement. The cost of construction at each site is estimated to be $1.7 billion. Russia and China ties enter new era as Xi meets Putin in Moscow. Xi signs an agreement with Russian President Vladimir Putin, cementing their no-limits partnership days after the latter was issued an international arrest warrant. China's President Xi Jinping has said He signed an agreement with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, bringing their ties into a new era of cooperation, as the two leaders called for responsible dialogue to resolve the Ukraine crisis. We signed a statement on deepening the strategic partnership and bilateral ties which are entering a new era, Xi said, following talks with Putin in the Kremlin on Tuesday. He added that China and Russia should work more closely to push forward greater practical cooperation. In turn, Putin said all agreements have been reached and that economic cooperation between Moscow and Beijing was a priority for Russia. The Chinese leader visited Moscow days after the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Putin for crimes committed in the neighboring country where Russian forces have made little progress in recent months despite suffering heavy losses. The talks were intended to cement the No Limits partnership, the two leaders announced last February, less than 3 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. On the conflict, the Chinese leader said Beijing was guided by the principles of the United Nations and promote a peaceful settlement of fighting in Ukraine. We're always for peace and dialogue, he added. A joint statement included familiar accusations against the West that Washington was undermining global stability and NATO was barging into the Asia-Pacific region. Putin said a Chinese proposal to end the conflict would be used as the basis for a peace settlement, but that the West and Kiev were not ready yet. We believe that many of the provisions of the peace plan put forward by China are consonant with Russian approaches and can be taken as the basis for a peaceful settlement when they're ready for that in the West and Kiev. However, so far, we see no such readiness from their side, Putin said. China's proposal, a 12-point paper calling for de-escalation and eventual ceasefire in Ukraine, lacked details on how to end the war. The United States has been dismissive of the plan, given Beijing's refusal to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and has said a ceasefire would lock in Russian territorial gains and give Putin's army more time to regroup. Responding to the meeting, the White House said China's position was not impartial and urged Beijing to pressure Russia to withdraw from Ukraine's sovereign territory to end the war. After the meeting with Xi, Putin accused Western powers of fighting to the last Ukrainian and praised the growing trade, energy, and political ties between China and Russia. Describing his talks with Putin as open and friendly, Xi reiterated China's neutral position on Ukraine and called for a dialogue. Kiev had welcomed China's diplomatic involvement, but said Russia must pull its troops out of Ukraine and underscore the importance of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Tuesday said Kiev had suggested to China that Beijing join a Ukrainian peace formula to end Russia's war in Ukraine, but that it was still waiting for an answer. The agreement also pushed forward the planned Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which would deliver 50 billion cubic meters, BCM, of natural gas per year from Russia to China via Mongolia. Putin said Moscow was ready to increase oil exports to Beijing after Russia, China, and Mongolia had completed all agreements on a planned pipeline to ship Russian gas. The pipelines gained urgency as Moscow seeks to replace Europe as its major gas customer. Russia news agency TASS reported that the two leaders also discussed the internet and agreed that they stand against militarization of information and communication technologies and support multilateral, equal, and transparent management of the internet. They support creation of a multilateral, equal, and transparent global management system of the internet with the support of sovereignty and security of all countries in the sphere, TASS quoted, the agreement is saying. Wow, very interesting. Unlimited possibilities. As a state dinner following the talks, Putin toasted the prosperity of the Russian and Chinese people. I'm sure that Russian-Chinese cooperation is truly unlimited possibilities and prospects, he said. Xi's state visit was a major boost to Putin as he squares off against what he sees as a hostile West bent on inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. Samuel Ramani, the associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, told Al Jazeera that while Tuesday's agreement was not an alliance, it was very clear that China and Russia are coordinating on a variety of fronts. The meeting between Xi and Putin coincided with a rare unannounced visit to Kiev by the Japanese Prime Minister that underscored Tokyo's support for Ukraine in its fight against Russia's invasion. Zelensky posted footage of him greeting Japan's Fumio Kishida, where or whom the Ukrainian leader called a truly powerful defender of the international order and a longtime friend of Ukraine. Wow, interesting dig at the end as well regarding Japan and Ukraine. From Erdu Point, Russia, China to prepare roadmap on nuclear technologies of future cooperation, Rosatom. Russia and China will prepare a roadmap for the implementation of a comprehensive program of long-term cooperation in the field of fast neutron reactors and closing the nuclear fuel cycle by the end of 2024, Russian State Nuclear Agency Rosatom said on Wednesday. This program was signed by Rosatom and China Atomic Energy Authority on Tuesday within the framework of the state visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow. The document is comprehensive and covers several key areas, including expanding cooperation in current projects, as well as implementing new projects related to fast neutron reactors, production of uranium, plutonium fuel, spent nuclear fuel management, Rosatom said. And from ang.beta.by, Lukashenko explains West's ire over Xi Jinping's visit to Russia. While talking to reporters in the World War II Memorial Complex Kaityn on 22 March, Belarus, President Alexander Lukashenko explained why the West is enraged due to Xi Jinping's visit to Russia, Belta has learned. Alexander Lukashenko said, "We're confident we're moving in the right direction, at least as far as Belarus and Russia are concerned. We're moving where doors are open for us. If a door is closed, why should we try to force it again? They'll come to us. They're silently coming out of the woodwork to reach us, trade, and the rest. Europe already complains about America while encouraging Europe to enforce sanctions over severed ties. Americans tried with Russians very well and so on. It's a business, and these lousy Western politicians create this situation with one hand and use the other hand to try not to only talk to us fraudulently, but trade with us and develop economy. This is why we go where we're welcome. We're doing the right thing, but they understood that they had done the wrong thing as well." Alexander Lukashenko reminded us about his previous meetings with high-ranking USA representatives during Donald Trump's presidency. Back then, the head of state told them, "Are you totally crazy? Tell your president that they've done the best thing for us, for Russia, and for China by bringing us all together. You, the West, simply bring us together, and they'll not hold against the front." The U.S. President's former National Security Advisor Bolton repeated it today. This is why they're enraged. They understood that they'd done everything to unite the mighty, resourceful space and nuclear power of Russia with the equally mighty, full of human resources, future-oriented nuclear power of China. One can say it's already the world's top power. This is why they're enraged, Alexander Lukashenko said. And watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, share, or a sub will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going. And from TASS News, Russia-Africa Conference shows multipolar world official. A number of those African countries that have come demonstrated these states' readiness to recognize what was unfolding and to treat positively, as well as not to regard Russia as an isolated country, but as a reliable partner. Russian State Duma Deputy Speaker Alexander Babakov said, "The Russia-Africa International Parliamentary Conference, which was held in Moscow on March 19th through 20th, has shown that a multipolar world has already been shaped." Alexander Babakov, Russian State Duma Deputy Secretary and Chairman of the conference's organization committee, told reporters. The result of the conference is that the multipolar world has already been shaped, or has already shaped. A number of those African countries that have come demonstrated the state's readiness to recognize what was unfolding and to treat positively, as well as not to regard Russia as an isolated country but as a reliable partner. There's no isolation of Russia either, the lawmaker stressed. The second Russia-Africa International Parliamentary Conference was held on the platform of the State Duma. Over 40 official parliamentary delegations from African countries took part in the event. The conference was aimed at strengthening parliamentary and cooperation within African countries in the context of multipolar world, developing relations and elaborating common approaches to legal regulation in the field of economy, science, and education and security. The conference was a preparatory event in the second Russia-Africa Summit to be held on July 27 through 28 in St. Petersburg. The first international conference took place in Moscow in 2019. And from modern diplomacy, international conference strengthens multifaceted relations between Russia and Africa. The International Parliamentary Conference Russia-Africa, held on 1920 March, has at least focused on complexities and contradictions of the emerging new global order, the role of Russia-Africa alliance against growing Western imperialism, and set the limits of Africa's expectations from Russia. The conference was to build further on previous comprehensive political dialogues between parliaments of Africa and Russia. President Vladimir Putin said at the plenary session of the International Parliamentary Conference Russia, Africa, and Multipolar World on March 20th, reminded that the first Russian-African summit held in October 2019 in Sochi was very productive and made it possible to noticeably revive our ties with African states, intensify business interaction, exchanges in the cultural and humanitarian spheres. That the partnership between Russia and African countries has gained additional momentum and is already reaching a qualitatively new level. He emphatically pointed out that the states of Africa are constantly increasing their weight and role in world affairs and are asserting themselves more and more confidently in politics and the economy. We're convinced that Africa will become one of the leaders in the emerging new multipolar world. There are all objective prerequisites for this, and there's about 1.5 billion people who live in Africa. A huge resource base is concentrated, almost a third of the world's mineral reserves. I would presume that this text has been translated, so I'll try my best to adapt it. Some of the grammar's a little bit, it has holes in it. African countries are striving to pursue an independent and sovereign foreign and domestic policy, sometimes difficult problems of their own as well. Russian and African countries uphold the norms of morality and social principles that are traditional for our peoples and oppose a neo-colonial ideology imposed from outside. By the way, many states of Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America adhere to similar positions and together make up the world majority. We're ready to jointly shape the global agenda, work together to strengthen fair and equal interstate relations, and improve mechanisms for mutually beneficial economic cooperation. We're preparing in the most serious way for the second Russian-African Summit, and of course a rich and meaningful agenda for the summit is being developed. It's planned to hold more than 100 of the most diverse events, he said about the forthcoming Grand Summit planned for July. Africa's made a huge leap in its development in recent decades, but its potential is yet to be unlocked, noted Valentina Matvienko, Speaker of the Federation Council. Africa is a continent with great potential which is yet to be fully unlocked. A continent with a population approaching 1.5 billion. A continent which has made a huge leap in its development, not only economic, but also social and scientific in recent decades, she said, at the Russia-Africa International Parliamentary Delegation. According to Matvienko, Africa's international prestige is also increasing. I think this is an absolutely objective and logical trend which the collective West, led by the United States, does not want to acknowledge. They want to preserve their superiority and role as a global hegemon, things that are becoming a thing of the past. They're reluctant to change their mentality of neocolonialism and are using well-known means of deterrence such as sanctions, threats, blackmail, double standards, and blatant hypocrisy, she noted. She stressed that Russia has always been committed to the principles of equality, mutual respect, the inherent right of each state to choose its own path of development, its own future without interference from the outside. Russia's cooperation, mutually respectful and equal with African countries, has been built on these principles for decades. Russia's friendship and cooperation with African countries is time-tested. That countries of the African continent have always been Russia's reliable partners and true allies. I'm convinced that it will continue like this. Our shared goal is to change the world for the better, to ensure the well-being and prosperity of the peoples of Russia and Africa, to spare no effort to ensure that hunger, dangers, diseases, and regional conflicts are extinguished, Matvienko added. Russian State Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin, speaking at the plenary session, highlighted relations between Russia and Africa. It's necessary to emphasize Russia and African countries are equal allies and partners. Our relations have always been built on an unselfish basis on the principles of mutual respect, stressing that for Russia, and non-interference in domestic affairs, Volodin said, stressing that for Russia, the African continent's never been a subject of mercantile interest, use of labor, and raw material resources. However, according to the speaker, the United States and Europe have a different approach. Washington and Brussels seek to take control of Russia and African natural resources. In fact, they continue their colonial policy. They go to any measures, including force and terrorist nature, for their own benefit. The politician pointed out, it's not for Washington to teach us how to build relationships, be friends, and make plans for the future, Volodin pointed out. He, however, describes Africa as a continent of freedom-loving people, and that friendship's a two-way street, and that Russian and African countries are at a new stage. Understandably, therefore, Russian and African countries are united by shared goals. We stand together for building a multipolar world, just world based on respect for traditions, culture, and history of the countries with which we're building mutually beneficial cooperation, Volodin said. Today, the African continent plays an important role in solving global and regional problems, and it will only grow, he said. Recall that despite illegal sanctions from Washington, Russia and African states are developing trade and economic cooperation. In particular, according to the politician, the trade turnover is growing, which at the end of last year amounted to $17.9 billion. While Russia and African parliamentarians continue forging solidarity against growing neo-colonial tendencies in Africa, Russia's also expressed readiness to push for Africa's economic developments by offering their legislative support. Legislators were convinced that parliaments could do a lot for the development of relations on the principles of respect, non-interference in international affairs of other states, and mutually beneficial cooperation. For comparison, 36 delegations from African countries took part in the first forum, which was held in 2019. This year, there were delegations from about 40 countries. Russia, contrary to Western assertions, doesn't isolate itself from the rest of the world. The increase in the number of participants confirms the special nature of friendly ties between Russia and Africa. Attempts by Washington and Brussels to isolate Africa and Russia have failed. Earlier during the first day, emphasized Chairman of the State Duma Vyacheslav Volodin. That, however, undeterred by the pressure from the United States to cancel Russia in their relationship, African parliamentarians have arrived in Moscow for a two-day working gathering to methodically develop Russian-African relations in various fields. In addition to the political dialogue, they're also focusing on economic, cultural, humanitarian, and scientific cooperation. According to the plan, Russian parliamentarians and African colleagues fixed topical issues of the international parliament, legislative response to economic challenges, indivisible security capabilities and contributions of parliaments, and neocolonialism of the West, how to prevent the repetition of history. The objectives of the conference are to strengthen parliamentary cooperation with African countries in the conditions of formation of a multipolar world, to develop relations, and to develop common approaches to legal regulation in the economy, science, and education security. The following roundtables held organized: legislative response to economic challenges. The modern economic challenges are crises caused by Western countries guided by the United States' numerous economic sanctions aimed at destroying the Russian economy, introduced in violation of all international trade rules and foreign economic relations. At the same time, most African countries supported friendly relations with Russia. Russia and Africa's position coincided on many issues. Unlike many Western countries, Russia does not have colonial experience, and the contribution of the Soviet Union to the liberation of African countries from colonial dependence is also well known. Africa stands for an equal partnership, mutual economic interests, including investments, cooperation in production chains, cooperation in strategic infrastructure projects, energy, medicine, and financial technologies. It's necessary to support the transformation processes of a multipolar world. Indivisible security, capabilities and contributions of parliaments. Participants of the roundtable discussion on the topic indivisible security, capabilities and contributions of parliaments thoroughly examined importance of sovereignty protection, non-interference in the international affairs of other countries, fight against poverty, countering terrorism, and military biological threats. Both Russia and Africa have similar challenges, are similar in many ways. Both Russia and African parliamentarians have joined their efforts contribute to the development of effective proposals which would help resolve conflicts. The challenges that our friends from African countries and the challenges that the Russian Federation are facing today are similar in many ways. The world's developing rapidly, and in this new world, we want justice, equal rights, and multipolarity, said the Deputy Chairman of the State Duma, Petr Tolstoy, opening the discussion. The Speaker of the National Assembly of the Parliament of South Africa, Nosiviwe Mapisa Nkalkule, noted the importance of maintaining the values of humanity and tolerance towards each other. She recalled that during the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries preferred to care about their own safety, and as a result, African states did not receive enough vaccines and lost human lives. There are still issues of climate change, poverty, human rights violations, and become a threat to peace and security, economy, and the peaceful existence of people around the world. We should support all humanity, and there should still be humanness in us, and only in the case when we treat others as tolerantly as possible, stressed Nosiviwe Mapisa Nkakula. The president of the National Council of the Transition of the Republic of Guinea, Dansa Kuruma, noted that the problem of imbalance in diplomatic relations in the context of neo-colonialism, the unilateral approach has become the rule. It's important to take into account and respect the sovereignty of states, he explained, and called for a more active fight against poverty, since such situations when people do not have access to a minimum set of services leads to insecurity in such countries. Neocolonialism of the West, how to prevent the repetition of history. Here, Russia and African countries want equal world without imposition of Western paradigm of consciousness. Leonard Slutsky, leader of the LDPR faction, chairman of the Committee on International Affairs, opening the meeting, thanked African countries that despite the difficult times gathered around Russia as a forward in the movement towards a multipolar world. The first deputy chairman of the Committee on International Affairs, Vyacheslav Nikonov, emphasized that there's an overwhelming majority of people supporting these values of sovereignty, respect for each other, democracy, non-interference in the affairs of others, according to the African parliaments, who spoke at the roundtable, believes that by granting independence to African countries, colonialism still exists on the continent, including transnational companies and non-governmental organizations that have become its main instruments. According to most of them, it's necessary now to promote economic independence and diversify the economies. It's definitely an important factor in countering sanctions and the consolidation of society, pursuing concrete development. But, unfortunately, after political liberation, many African colonies retain the old economic structures and dependence on imports from the metropolises. President of the nonprofit organization Foundation for the Study of Historical Perspective, Natalia Nitskaya, tried to answer the basic question, why Russia is countering neo-colonialism. In the process, she explained the colossal fluctuations in economy, faith, standards of living, and climate in Africa. The moment of truth for Africa, she continued, is that there must be a change in the economy, that officials should work to ensure that at least infrastructure projects are being implemented in Africa. Chairman of the state, Duma Vyacheslav Volodin, held bilateral meetings with several heads of delegations, speakers of parliament, and chambers of parliament of African countries. On March 19th, a bilateral meeting of the chairman of the state of Duma Vyacheslav Volodin and the Speaker of the National Assembly of the Republic of Zimbabwe, Jacob Mudenda, was held at the State Duma. The State Duma and the National Assembly of Zimbabwe signed the agreement in 2022. It's very important to do everything to implement this agreement. We propose to create an interparliamentary commission which will enable us to work more substantively on issues that are important for both our states, Jacob Mudenda emphasized at the meeting. According to him, relations between countries should be built on the principles of mutual respect, mutual beneficial cooperation, and non-interference in the international affairs of sovereign states. Russia and Zimbabwe now share common political interests. Both are under sanctions. Frequent interactions such as conferences demonstrate the importance of relations at the parliamentary level between Africa and the Russian Federation. They'll significantly advance understanding and strengthen relations between Russia and the countries of Africa. Such meetings will help share experience between the African states and the Russian Federation and develop solutions. There's also an exchange of views and developments of positions on international security. You know these issues are the most relevant now. South Africa's National Assembly Speaker Nosiviwe Mapisa Nkakula supported his suggestion that great capabilities on parliamentary dimension of Russia and South Africa could be used to enhance our cooperation in various areas in South Africa and in Africa. Mapisa Nkakula thanked Vyacheslav Volodin for sending the invitation to take part in the parliamentary conference, before adding it's very important for us that Russia gives priority to the African continent. Many countries consider Africa as a great possibility to get African resources, but taking into account the history of our cooperation, we, like many other African countries, believe that Russia has other, more genuine interests in Africa. And from republicworld.com, relationship between African countries and Russia based on equality, says Duma Speaker. The Speaker of Russia's Duma highlighted the country's growing trade and economic cooperation with African states despite what he called illegal sanctions. During the plenary session of the Second Russia-Africa International Parliamentary Conference on Monday, Vyacheslav Volodin, the Russian State Duma Speaker, claimed that relations between Russia and Africa countries have been established on the principles of equality and selflessness. According to Volodin, this stands in stark contrast to the colonial policies being pursued by the United States and Europe. It's necessary to emphasize Russia and African countries are equal allies and partners. Our relations have always been built on an unselfish basis, on the principle of mutual respect and non-interference in domestic affairs, he said. As per a report from TASS, he stressed the fact that African continents have never been a subject of mercantile interest, use of labor and raw material resources for Russia. Volodin accuses U.S. and Europe of a colonial approach. In Volodin's judgment, U.S. and Europe have a completely different approach. Washington and Brussels seek to take control of Russia and Africa natural resources. In fact, they continue their colonial policy. They go to any measure, including force and terrorist nature, for their own benefit, he claimed. Volodin added that Washington cannot dictate to Moscow how it should develop its ties with other regions around the globe. The Speaker of Russia's Duma highlighted the country's growing trade and economic cooperation with African states despite what he called illegal sanctions from Washington. According to the politician, bilateral trade reached $17.9 billion at the end of the last year. In his remarks, the Speaker emphasized the increasingly significant role played by the African continent in addressing both regional and global issues, suggesting that this trend is set to continue. A look at Africa's geopolitical importance. Africa is a continent of great geopolitical significance, with its vast landmass, abundant natural resources, and strategic location at the crossroads of major trade routes between Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Its importance is further amplified by the fact that it's home to some of the fastest growing economies in the world, making it a key player in the global economy. One of the most significant reasons why Africa is geopolitically important is its vast natural resources. The continent is home to some of the world's largest reserves of oil, gas, coal, and other minerals, including gold, platinum, and diamonds. These resources are crucial to the global economy, and many countries depend on them for their energy and manufacturing needs. Additionally, Africa's agricultural potential is enormous, with fertile soil and a diverse range of crops that can feed not only its own population, but also those of other countries. Africa's strategic location is another key factor that makes it geopolitically important. The continent sits at the intersection of major trade routes between Europe Asia, and the Americas. The Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean and Red Seas, is a vital shopping route that passes through Africa. Additionally, the continent's proximity to the Middle East, Europe, and Asia has made it a critical hub for global trade, and its ports and shipping lanes are some of the busiest in the world. Moreover, Africa's growing population and rapidly expanding economies are also important geopolitical factors according to the United Nations. Africa's population is expected to double by 2050, making it the fastest growing region in the world. This growth has the potential to create vast new markets and opportunities for investment and trade, which could help to drive economic growth and development in the region. And from Al Mayadeen, Russia, Africa to jointly build new world order. Putin announces that Moscow is ready to provide most needed African nations with free grain in the event that Russia decides not to renew the recent 60-day extension deal. Russia President Vladimir Putin said African nations will become one of the main pillars and pioneers of the New World Order, stressing that relations between Russia and Africa are developing to unprecedented levels, and Moscow aims to expand these ties. Putin made these remarks addressing the Russia-Africa in a Multipolar World plenary session as part of the second Russia-Africa International Parliamentary Conference held on Monday, which is attended by representatives of over 40 African countries. African states are constantly increasing their role in world affairs, more and more confidently declare their position in politics and economics. We're convinced that Africa will become one of the leaders of the emerging multipolar world order, he said. Despite only accounting for 3% of the world GDP, African countries are witnessing exponential economic growth, Putin noted, adding that Russia aspires to reach a strategic partnership with the African nations to jointly transition the current global affairs into the new world order. Highlighting that Moscow has dropped over $20 billion of African countries' debt, he emphasized the need to development, coordination, and expand cooperation in areas of mutual interest such as energy, healthcare, and the military field, stressing that Moscow will continue helping the continent expand electrical grids and energy generation. So, Africa is at once a leader in having natural resources, but only accounting for 3% of the world GDP, and that's due to exploitation of those natural resources. So, in a sense, when natural resources are devalued, we devalue the world. Not in a sense, literally, actually. Who owns those natural resources and how they're disseminated is another story, right? So Russia is ready to send African nations laboratories and medicinal drugs to establish joint efforts in the mutual development of the healthcare sector and the production of medicines, Putin added. Military technical cooperation continues, including supply of Russian weapons and military equipment to African partners, Putin stated, noting that military service members from over 20 African countries are currently in Russia studying at universities of the Russian Defense Ministry. He also recalled that Russia was one of the first countries to provide Africa with vaccines and other medicinal drugs and hardware to assist the continent's fight against COVID-19 during the pandemic. On the grain deal that was just extended for 60 days, the Russian leader emphasized that Moscow insists on the full implementation of the agreement with regards to its terms, including securing a larger amount of the food commodity to the African countries. Out of the total amount of grain and food exported from Ukraine, approximately 45% went to European countries and only 3% goes to Africa, Putin explained, revealing that Moscow agreed to the extension of the deal having in mind the need of African countries and other developed nations. Out of 827 grain ships that left Ukraine between August 1st and September 20th of 2022, only 3 million tons of grain were delivered to Africa, and only nearly a third reached the poorest African nations. Moscow will demand the full implementation of Russia's main terms to the extension of the deal, including addressing the food needs of African nations rather than well-fed so-called European countries. Despite sanctions and restrictions, Russia delivered to Africa nearly 12 million tons during the same period, August 1st, September 20th of 2022, Putin underlined. He stressed that Russia has sent almost 12 million tons of grain to African countries despite all restrictions. If Russia decides not to renew this deal after the recent 60-day extension, then it's ready to deliver all the volume that was previously sent to countries in Africa with dire need free of charge, the president added. Towards the end of the address, the president invited the leaders of the African countries to attend the upcoming Russia-Africa summit scheduled in July to take place in St. Petersburg. We're very seriously preparing for the second Russian-African summit, and of course, we'll be glad to see leaders from all African countries, as well as heads of regional organizations at this forum. Russia and Africa jointly aim for a just world. On his part, the head of Russia's State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, said Russia and African nations have a mutual goal to build a new multipolar world. Russia and African countries are united by shared goals. We stand together for building a multipolar world, just world based on respect for the traditions, culture, and history of the countries with which we're building mutually beneficial cooperation, Volodin said. The conference brought together nations that are aware of the price of independence and how to decide for themselves how to live, he said, stressing that Russia-Africa relations are at a new stage. Africa is a continent of freedom-loving people. Together, we can withstand any external pressure, as we've already done in our history. Friendship's a two-way street, he added. From the Africa Report, Russia draws in Africa with charm offensive against Western neocolonialism. On 19th and 20 March, some 40 African delegations traveled to Moscow ahead of the Russia-Africa Summit scheduled for July in St. Petersburg to discuss cooperation and the fight against the influence former colonial powers. There's but one step between Vladimir Putin's office and the Duma in central Moscow. It was at the Russian parliament headquarters, just a few meters from the Kremlin, that the conference Russia-Africa and Multipolar World was held from 1920 March, the second of its kind devoted to strengthening cooperation between Africa and Russian parliamentarians. The meeting came ahead of the next Africa-Russia summit to be held in St. Petersburg at the end of July, 4 years after the Sochi summit. The Soviet-style building was specially refurbished to accommodate the 40 African delegations. At the opening ceremony, Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin gave a speech on Russian and Western influences in Africa. Dear colleagues, it's not Washington that should teach us how to build our friendly relations and plans for the future, he said, defending Russian interests in Africa, which he said had never been mercantile, unlike those of the U.S. and European countries. On Monday, 20 March, Vladimir Putin spoke at the conference between two meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's on an official 3-day visit to Russia. The Russian president insisted on the need to cooperate more with African countries, one of the priorities of his foreign policy before announcing the free delivery of grain to the continent if the food agreement between Russia and Ukraine is not renewed. He also said that African soldiers from some 20 countries were currently being trained in Russia. Among the audience were many African parliamentarians, the president of Mali, Conseil National de la Transition, Colonel Malik Dow, a member of the ruling junta in Bamako, which has made Russia its new ally, denounced the perpetuation of domination by former colonial powers. Ousmane Bougouma of Burkina Faso, president of l'Assemblée Législative de la Transition, the TLA, also attended the conference, as did the vice president of Chad, CNT, Maloum Yoboidi Jiraki, and the president of Guinea's CNT, Dansa Koruma. Simplest Mathieu Sarangi, Central Africa's National Assembly president, Jacob Mudenda, Zimbabwe's National Assembly spokesperson, and Hamoud Abdenasser, Algerian Council Vice President, also took part in roundtables. Guinea-Bissau's Parliament Speaker Cipriano Kassama met with Volodin on the conference sidelines, as he did Sarangi, Diao, and Bougouma. After their meeting, Bougouma spoke of the creation of a bilateral working commission between Russia and Burkina Faso and reiterated his willingness to cooperate with Moscow, saying, "The partnership with Russia is not a short-term phenomenon, it's a long-term choice based on trust." The Duma president also met with Congolese Senate President Pierre Ngolo and South African National Assembly President Nosaviwe Mapisa Nkakula. And watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. And from TurkeyNewspaper.com, deportation of Zionist ambassador in Amman is discussed in Jordan. The Jordanian House of Representatives has requested the government to expel the Zionist ambassador in Amman. According to the news of Jordanian state television Al Mamlaka, in the session held in the House of Representatives, Israel's far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich used a map showing Jordan and Israeli land during a memorial service in Paris. The deputies who took the floor in the session reacted harshly to the Zionist minister. During the session, it was noteworthy that on the podium of the General Assembly there was a map similar to the one used by Smotrich containing the Jordanian and Palestine flags. In his speech, Parliament Speaker Ahmed Es-Safedi called on the government as the House of the Representatives. We demand effective actions from the government against the finance minister of the occupation government, which used the so-called Zionist map covering the borders of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the occupied Palestinian territories. It's not the so-called Zionist, it would be the so-called Israel map, so-called Israel map. Reminding that international agreements have been violated, Safedi said this is a situation that cannot be ignored and is against the peace agreement signed between Jordan and Zionist Israel in 1994 and international norms. The deputies decided to request the government to expel the Zionist ambassador in Amman in a vote in the parliamentary session. In a written statement, the Foreign Relations Committee of the Parliament, a call was made to review the peace agreement between Jordan and the Zionists. In the statement, it was stated that Smotrich's actions will not harm Jordan and will not take away the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to live in an independent state. Zionist far-right minister Smotrich, in his speech at the commemoration of former Likud party chairman Jacques Kupfer during his visit to Paris on March 19, said, "There's no such thing as Palestine and the White House should hear it." It was also noteworthy that Smotrich used the Zionist map, including Jordan, in the podium where he spoke. The Jordanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs reacted to this situation and emphasized that Smotrich's use of an Israeli map, so-called Israeli map, that included Jordan and the occupied Palestine territories were a reckless provocation and a violation of international norms in the peace agreement. The ministry stated that the Zionist government should take a clear stance against such extremist behavior and hateful statements, and summoned Eitan Sorkis, Zionist ambassador to Amman, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Zionist Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on the other hand, made a short statement on March 24, stating that they respect Jordan's territorial integrity and are committed to the peace agreement that they signed with the country in 1994. The lower house on Wednesday voted in favor of a motion recommending the government to expel Zionist ambassadors to Jordan in protest of recent remarks made by a far-right minister in the Zionist government. During a legislative session attended by cabinet members, lower house speaker Ahmad Safadi called on the government to take effective measures against the Zionist minister of finance for using an alleged map of Israel that includes the borders of the kingdom and the occupied Palestinian territories, according to the Jordanian news agency Petra. The lawmakers expressed their rejection of the Zionist minister's actions and affirmed their support for the leadership of His Majesty King Abdullah and the armed forces in defending the country and its sovereignty. They also criticized the Zionist minister's actions as lacking respect for international treaties and conventions. In response to the deputy's interventions, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Local Administration Tawfiq Kreisham stated that such events unify the Jordanians and emphasize that the map of Jordan is drawn solely by Jordanians. During Wednesday's session, Safadi also called for effective measures to be taken regarding the finance minister's actions, pointing out that this is a matter that cannot be ignored and continues a breach of the peace treaty and international norms. The occupation force's criminal and extremist actions undermine comprehensive peace efforts, he said. Safadi confirmed that the House will take urgent action with Arab and international parliaments and will address their governments to expose the occupation and take steps to reject all extremist measures undertaken. He also emphasized that the Al-Karami battle will always serve as a testament to the resilience and unwavering determination of Jordanians, adding that any misguided actions of extremists within the occupation government will be met with resistance, according to Petra. Jordan Parliament votes to expel Zionist ambassador. This is from Asharq al-Assad. Jordan's parliamentary voted on Wednesday to expel the Zionist ambassador in Amman in protest of Bezalel Smotrich's appearance at a podium appeared with a Zionist flag that included all of Jordan and the Palestinian territories. House Speaker Ahmed Safadi called on the government to take effective measures against the minister's statement and behavior. MP said Smotrich's behavior reflects Zionist arrogance and disrespect of international treaties and conventions. The vote's not binding to the government, but reflects public outrage of the Zionist far-right provocations against the Palestinians and Jordanians. Smotrich's appearance and ensuing remarks in which he claimed there's no such thing as a Palestinian people sparked furor in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Saudi Arabia condemned on Tuesday the minister's offensive and racist remarks. The foreign minister underscored the kingdom's rejection of such baseless statements that only stoke hatred and violence and undermine international efforts for peace and dialogue. Jordan's foreign minister, Ayman Safadi, decried on Tuesday the minister's comments as racist. Amman, late on Monday, summoned the Israeli ambassador in Jordan and said Smotrich's move was provocative and extremist and racist, and it violated international norms and Jordan's peace treaty with the Zionists. From Globe World News Echo, the Jordanian parliament votes to expel the Israeli ambassador. Yesterday, the Jordanian parliament voted on a recommendation to the government to expel the Zionist ambassador from Amman in protest against the racial statements and actions of the Zionist finance minister Bezalel Smotrich toward Jordan and Palestine. According to the Jordan news agency Petra, this came during the legislative session held yesterday by the House of Representatives, headed by its Speaker Ahmed al-Safadi, and in the presence of the cabinet. Al-Safadi called on the government to take effective measures against the Zionist Minister of Finance's use of an alleged map that included borders of the kingdom and the occupied Palestinian territories. The deputies affirmed their rejection of what came from the Zionist minister's actions, stressing their understanding behind the leadership of King Abdullah II and the armed forces, the Arab Army, and the security services in confronting anyone who tries to undermine the homeland and its sovereignties. They pointed out what the Zionist minister did reflects Zionist arrogance that does not respect international treaties and covenants, calling on the government to take action to confront these reckless behaviors. From Barat Times, Amman's parliament displays Israel with Palestine-Jordan flags, calls to expel the envoy. Amman's parliament displays Zionist flag with Palestine-Jordan flag, calls to expel envoy. Jordan's parliament on Wednesday recommended expelling Zionist ambassador in the center of his chamber, displaying a map of Jordan, Zionist Israel, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, all under the colors of the Jordanian and Palestinian flag. The vote and the map came in response to a speech over the weekend by Zionist Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, in which he claimed the Palestinian people an invention while standing with a map of greater so-called Israel that includes the Hashemite kingdom's territory according to the fanatical aspirations of some fringe extremists. The expulsion of Zionist ambassador Eitan Circus would require approval from the Jordanian government. An unlikely scenario. Circus was summoned by Amman's foreign ministry on Monday night in protest of Smotrich's speech. Symbolic votes to expel Zionist envoys are common at a time of heightened tensions between Jerusalem and Amman. In May 2021, Jordanian MP unanimously called the Zionist envoy was expelled by the government amid Operation Guardian of the Walls on an 11-day war between Zionist and militant groups in the Gaza Strip. Speaking in Paris at a private memorial service on Sunday for a prominent right-wing Likud activist, Smotrich claimed that the Palestinian people are an invention from the last century and that people like him and his grandparents were the real Palestinians. Smotrich said that there was no such thing as Palestinians because there's no such thing as Palestinian people, a comment that was met with applause and cheers from attendees in footage posted online.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Tell me this, Sir Smotrich. How might it be that you are Palestinian and the Palestinians do not exist? simultaneously. How is this possible? Do you know who the Palestinians are? Asked the head of the ultra-nationalist religious Zionism party and Zionist finance minister. I am Palestinian, he said, referred to his grandmother, who was born 100 years ago in the northern Zionist town of Metula, and his grandfather, a 13th generation Jerusalemite, as real as Palestinians. 13th generation. The truth needs to be heard in Washington at the White House. The whole world needs to hear this truth because it's the truth, and the truth will prevail.
What is this nothing you talk about? What is this nothing you talk about?
The comments drew a harsh response from the Jordanian foreign minister, which called them a reckless provocation and a violation of international norms in the Jordan Peace Treaty. Given Jordan's anger over the speech, Zion's foreign minister sought to tone down the response. Zionists remain committed to the 1994 peace accord with Jordan. There's no change in the position of the state of the Zionists, which recognizes the territorial integrity of the Hashemite kingdom, the ministry tweeted in both Hebrew and English. It didn't mention Smotrich's remarks about the Palestinians. And a Zionist diplomat told the Times of Zionists on Wednesday that Jerusalem understood Jordan's sensitivities, adding that they were working to send a message of reconciliation. Zionist relationship with Jordan is vital to regional peace and stability, the official said. They got their message across, the official said, stressing that the foreign ministry is acting on the basis of the government's decision to strengthen ties with Jordan because they're important. The United States got included, and several other countries condemned the comments on Tuesday. Jordan's King Hussein holds a light to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's cigarette after the Jordan Peace Treaty signed ceremony in Aqaba, Jordan, Wednesday in 1994, October 26, 1994. Wow, that's really interesting. So Smotrich has a history of making inflammatory statements against Palestinians, Arab citizens of Zionist Israel, non-Orthodox Jews, and the LGBTQ community. Earlier this month, he said he would wipe out Palestinians in West Bank. His comments come after Zionist and PA delegations held a relatively rare but low-stakes regional summit in Sharm el-Sheikh on Sunday, where they sought to ease tensions just days before the start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan was recommended. They also agreed to combat incitement to violence. And from Al-Mayadeen, Amman calls for expulsion of Zionist envoy over Smotrich statements. The Jordanian parliament asked the government to expel the Zionist ambassador to Amman in protest of the statements made by Zionist finance minister Bezalel Smotrich as well as his actions. Al-Mayadeen's correspondent reported on Wednesday the Jordanian MPs voted unanimously on the request to expel Tel Aviv's ambassador, Al-Mayadeen correspondent reported, adding that the Jordanian parliament raised during the session a map similar to the one used by Smotrich in Paris, but it had the Jordanian and Palestinian flags. During his participation in an event in Paris, Smotrich, who heads the religious Zionist party, appeared on Sunday giving a speech on a podium bearing the map of the so-called Greater Israel, which included Jordan and the occupied Palestinian territories. Moreover, during this event, the Zionist far-right minister claimed that there's no such thing as Palestine because there's no such thing as Palestinian people. Who are the real Palestinians? I'm Palestinian, he said, adding that Palestinian people are an invention of less than 100 years ago.
What is this nothing you talk about?
His statements and actions are a reckless incitement and a violation of international norms and the Jordanian Zionist Peace Treaty, said Jordan Foreign Minister spokesman Sanan Majali. We also condemn the racist and extremist inciting statements made by the extremist Zionist minister against the brotherly Palestinian people, their right to exist, and their historical rights in their independent and sovereign state on the Palestinian national soil, Majali underlined. The Jordanian spokesperson said that Smotrich's actions were dangerous, underlining that Israeli occupation government must take a clear and open position toward such extremists and the inflammatory and malicious statements by a serving minister. The statement called on the international community to condemn Smotrich's inflammatory actions and statements, which are in violation of human values and principles. In response, the Zionist Occupation Foreign Ministry claimed later on Monday that Zionists are committed to the peace agreement with Jordan from 1994. There's been no change in the position of the state of the Zionists, which recognizes the territorial integrity of the Hashemite kingdom, the occupation ministry insisted. Earlier, Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh blasted the inflammatory remarks made by Smotrich. Speaking before the cabinet meeting of the Palestinian Authority on Monday, Shtayyeh said the inflammatory statements are consistent with the first Zionist sayings of a land without a people for a people without a land. Deportation of Zionist ambassador in Jordan, Amman, discussed in Jordan. According to the news of Jordanian state television Al Mamlaka, the session held in the House of Representatives, Zionist far-right Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich used a map showing Jordan as Zionist land during a memorial service in Paris. The deputies who took the floor in the session reacted harshly to the Israeli minister. And during the session, it was noteworthy that on the podium of the General Assembly, there was a map similar to the one used by Smotrich containing the Jordanian and Palestinian flags. In his speech, Parliament Speaker Ahmed Es-Safadi called on the government as the House of Representatives. We demand effective actions from the government against the finance minister of the occupation government, which uses the so-called Zionist map covering the borders of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the occupied Palestine territories. Reminding that international agreements have been violated, Safadi said this is a situation that cannot be ignored and is against the peace agreement signed by Jordan and the Zionists in 1994. I'm going to open up a channel here. Beam me up.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Mr. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.